here.
Oak Hall. So I went here with Oak Hall. Ginger Powers, All Souls. Rand Nixon, All Souls. Regina Mallory, Oak Hall. Susie Muscali. I'm a friend of Regina's, and I live in the Crestwood area, down the street.
Just down the street. We're all neighbors.
My neighbors.
Bob Watson, friends of these two over here, and who are he's a member of the church here, and Steve's not a member of the church, but he's
Friends.
good person.
Yes. Great.
My name is Joyce, and I'm a UU, and this is the second time I've taken this class. I enjoyed it so much the first time, so here I am again.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
I'm Stevie Reynolds. I am a friend. I have friends. I'm quasi All Souls.
And we were in a class together a few years ago, a different class together, not one I was teaching, we were taking one together. Yes.
Steve O'Call.
Brenda Colon O'Call. Kathy Migron O'Call.
Evelyn Maddox, All Souls, and O'Call.
Yay.
Patty Harrington for the Kate. She told me how much she enjoyed the Greek mythology class, so I try this.
Yay.
Corey, All Souls.
Delaney, All Souls.
Thomas Gordon, both All Souls.
Marta Chasteen, my friend Linda. Oh,
Yay.
I'm Linda Gergovich, and I'm a good friend of Jane Gilbert, so she told me about this.
Interesting connections. Yeah, you're a friend of a friend, and we're in the same Tai Chi class together, and she's an artist. I mean, it's these weird connections. So I know Linda from like 3 different ways, I think.
Deanna Dyckman, friend of O'Call, friend.
Okay.
Meet them a lot also.
Yay. This is exciting. We seem to have sort of O'Call is on that side and also on this side. But not absolutely. We'll intermingle more as we move along. Okay, so in this is a basic introduction to Western art. I do have another class that I've taught and will teach again maybe in the fall on the art of Asia, where we look at India, China, Japan. We just go through Asia. That's different. We're not dealing with that here. This is strictly a Western tradition, and it's a survey course, an overview. So, I'm sorry if we missed something you really wanted to talk about, but we just can't cover everything. We're just touching on, because we're doing like 40,000 years in a few weeks. If there's anything, you really, really want to hear about, or a person or a work of art, whatever, tell me. If I'm not planning on it, I'll slip it in for you somehow. So getting started, I call it, this series is called Art and Culture, because that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in people, the people who make art, the people for whom art was made. And right away, we're already into tricky definitions, because what is art? If anybody ever tries to give you a definition of art, don't listen, because there is no such thing as a definition of art. And the broader your knowledge, the more obvious that is, because many of the things we look at from other times and other places are not at all what might be called art by someone today. So we're looking at material culture, things that people make. There are some things that art has in common, but not enough to make it like a definition. One of the things that I think, in my opinion, that all art has in common is it tends to be about things that matter. May not matter to you, but it mattered to the person that made it. So it's giving you information about a culture, a place, and a time. Also, I do want to point out that, again, my point of view, but art is not timeless. Art is very grounded in a particular place and a particular time. It's not universal. And when I hear, art is universal, it's wrong. That implies so many wrong assumptions, I don't even know where to begin. But I think by the time we get through all of this, it will be fairly obvious. In fact, many of the things we're going to look at, especially early on, are not things that the majority of people would call art today, but they are things that people made. Okay, so we're going to look at sort of changing human values, how people thought, how people saw the world, what mattered to them, and how that hierarchy has changed over time. And it's changed quite dramatically. Just a couple of terms. Some of you, if you heard me give a talk before, have heard these things, but just a little bit of the language of art. I'm not going to spend much time on it. When we talk about art, we talk about subject, form, and context. Every work of art brings together these three things. Every work of art is about something. It has a subject. It's about something. It's either an image of something, a symbolic reference to something, but it's about something. There's no such thing as a work of art that's not about anything. That doesn't exist. It has form. Form simply means all of the choices an artist made to communicate this idea. If they're a painter, then the form would be the colors, the brushwork, the composition and design. If they're a sculptor, it might mean the materials they use, how they put things together. So first you have an idea, and then you have to figure out how to express that idea. So you have to make choices about the form you're going to put that idea into. And then context, which is really outside the work of art. That is all of the external things that affect a work of art. And that's something that comes from the time and place where you live. I mean, you may think right now that you have absolute free choice to make and do anything you want, but I guarantee you that's not true. Our culture has predetermined what art is to a certain extent, and there are things you can do, and there are things, if you choose to do them, you'll be mocked by our culture. You won't be forbidden from doing it, but it won't even occur to you to do it because you are a person of this moment in time. So there's always a context when art is made. So those are the things we'll look at as we talk about art. In fact, everything you want to know about any work of art that's ever been made, you can understand if you know those three things. That's really all there is to know about art. Everything fits into either subject, form, or context. Just my go-to analogy of how important these things are to look at. You know, so many people see subject. That's usually what the majority of people see in a work of art. That's a vase of flowers. That's a landscape. They see subject. But look how important form can be. Now, these are two different scenes of the Last Supper. Of course, the most famous Leonardo's. We're familiar with that. We'll talk about it later when we get there. They're about 100 years apart, and the world changed very dramatically. So one of the things we'll talk about when we get to that point is why these are so different, and I'll bring them back to you, and we'll see why Leonardo's looks like this and Tintoretto's looks like that. Let's talk about the beginning. Where does it begin? The earliest images and objects made by human beings come in two forms, either three-dimensional sculptural pieces, small pieces. Now, this is small. You can see the gentleman on the left there is holding it in his hand. They're typically that size, 3 to 4 inches. It's considered this individual one is the oldest known sculpture. As of now, it's the oldest thing that we have found. That's not to say it's the first one ever made. Of course, we are always limited to what we have, what has come down to us. And of course, the older something is, the less likely we're going to have very many of them that have come down to us. This is the earliest one. We have many of these small figures. They're little, they're sometimes referred to as mother goddess figures. They used to call them Venus figures, which is totally wrong. I'm so glad they stopped using that terminology. But they're small figures. Now, because this is 35,000 years old, there is no way on earth I'm going to tell you exactly what this means and why they made it, because there's no way we could ever know that. We can only make assumptions. Many of the assumptions we make about very early pieces can be influenced by things that have happened later and things that we know now. And we can also look at modern day early cultures. Now, we can say the Stone Age ended a long time ago, but if you remember, there have been Stone Age cultures discovered on this planet not that long ago, and there are very likely people living in Stone Age cultures that we have not encountered. Fewer and fewer places on this planet have been untouched by human presence, but there are still places. There are villages, say, in remote islands like Borneo. This is one place where they've found 20 years ago Stone Age people. The minute you find those cultures, they cease being Stone Age cultures because now we've contaminated them with the modern world and things change. But there are certainly tribal cultures that still exist and operate and function very much as they did 20,000 years ago. And so there are ways to understand. We have found many of these pieces. Well, first of all, it's a female figure. They never really have a head, and they're exaggerated forms. The assumption being they're fertility figures, they're associated with nature, they're sort of nature goddess figures. That is our assumption. You know, we could be 100% wrong. I don't think we are. I think it's probably fairly reasonable. They symbolize abundance and fertility. They're undoubtedly meant to signify pregnancy associated with the earth. It's one of the oldest, truest, deeply embedded human associations is to link the female body with the earth, fertility, etc. Now, the fact that we can find similar objects in many different places, people have made a lot of suggestions. One suggestion is that these would be traded with other tribal groups. If you're traveling, it's sort of like a goodwill thing. You trade one with that group and they trade one with you. Maybe that would explain why they could be so widespread or similar styles. But the fact is, we don't know. What we do know is this isn't a little decorative piece you put on a shelf somewhere to look at. It's important. It signifies something important to them. And of course, we know at this point in time, this is the Upper Paleolithic. Lith means stone. So Paleolithic is the old Stone Age, and Upper Paleolithic means the late period of the late Stone Age. So this is the Upper Paleolithic, which lasts a very long time. Other than that, we don't know too much. So that's the oldest one we found. This is the most famous. This is the one that appears in most of the early textbooks. It's known as the Woman of Willendorf because it was found in Austria. Many of these have been found in the Alps.
Where was this found?
This is from Austria. The previous one was found in Germany. But they would have been made around Europe. So this is probably in the best shape, the best condition. That, you know, my students always used to think that she was wearing like a knit cap. It does look like it, right? But that's not really what it's meant to be. We don't know what that symbolizes. But in addition to figures like this, we have a lot of just round stones that have that same pattern on them. So this is symbolic of something. No, it's not meant to look like her head. It's symbolic of something, but we don't have any idea what or why her head looks like that. Most of them don't have a head. In this case, they took two things, like a round stone with this design, and put it on her as if it were her head. So I don't know what that means. We think about it. We'll never know, I'm sure, what that means because we don't have, you know, there was no writing. That's another thing that limits us. In addition to three-dimensional, the other thing we have are, of course, two-dimensional or paintings on cave walls. And in this case, this is the oldest known cave art, and it dates from about 38,000 BCE. Now, this is only handprints. There are handprints on a number of cave walls along with animal images, but this oldest one is only handprints. Now, what's interesting about this find is that it was found in a cave that was inhabited only by Neanderthals. Now, up until then, everyone has believed that all cave paintings were done by Homo sapiens, that only the Homo sapiens sapien, which is us, had the intelligence to paint cave walls. It is clear to everyone that this was done by Neanderthals. Now, this was right about at the end of the reign. This is just about when Neanderthals disappear. You know, right around this period, they're completely replaced by the Homo sapiens. But we didn't know that Neanderthals would make art. You know, people always, we think ourselves, we're the brilliant ones, right? They were just dumb animals. Well, that's not the case at all. And we're learning more and more about Neanderthals. That's actually one of the more interesting areas right now is Neanderthal studies. Were they more than we thought they were? Is it just us who were doing all of this? And what does it mean? I don't know. You know, it's really tempting to make assumptions. You know, one of the expressions we use in art a lot is we refer to the hand of the artist, which is a metaphor that refers to a unique style of a particular artist is called their hand. I mean, it's a symbol of their style. So this is literally the hand of the artist. So it's really interesting. Were they saying, I'm here? Did someone just discover this interesting technique? We don't know what the hands mean, but they are found a lot. They're not really, I think it goes a little too far to call it a signature, but it does say it does say I'm here, if nothing else. It says that.
It's also easy to imprint.
You're right. It's an easy thing. It's an easy print. And we do know how they made the pigment. They spit it. It's been reproduced. So French archaeologists discovered this a while ago, and there was a really interesting film made of him doing it. But they would chew on the pigment, and then you spit at it like an airbrush. It's like your mouth becomes an airbrush, and that creates this soft image you see around it. Clearly, it's not brushed or anything. It's just spit on the wall like an airbrush, and it really works. You can cover a lot of surface that way. Well, does it mean anything? I think it means something. I don't think it's just frivolous. I think it's serious. This is the earliest known figurative image, and this is not from the Western world, but I did want to bring it into you to show it to you because it is the earliest. It's from Indonesia, not the Western world, but it's the earliest, and it was made by people who were the Indonesian equivalent to Neanderthals. It was not made by Homo sapiens. It was made by a people who were roughly equivalent to the Western European Neanderthals, because Neanderthals are really only Western Europe. They're not all over the world, but there are equivalents to them in other places. It's called the Sulawesi pig. Sulawesi is an island in Indonesia where it was found, and it's a very good representation of a warthog. And I've seen images of warthogs that they would hunt, and they're very similar to this figure. So this is the old, and notice there is a hand print in Indonesia next to it. Now, here's something more interesting. That handprint was put down 10,000 years later than the pig. Now, I want you to think about time. You know, our sense of time is so different. In 43,500, roughly, someone created that pig. 10,000 years later, someone else made a handprint next to it. Isn't that interesting? That cave is used for 10,000 years. Can you imagine your home? Someone lives in your home for 10,000 years. It's not going to happen.
Why is that 2D?
Pardon?
Why is it a 2D figure? It says oldest known as 2D.
Oh, two-dimensional. It's on a flat surface. Two-dimensional art is on a flat surface. Three-dimensional art is in the round.
But everything we've seen has been two-dimensional.
No, these were three-dimensional. The sculptures were three-dimensional. Yeah, those were 3D.
Maybe it had been etched in.
Oh no, it's just paint, but they do that. They do both, and I only want to show you this one.
Hey, Peggy.
Yes.
Were you going to share your screen with everybody on Zoom?
Didn't I?
No.
Oh my God, Angie. I'm so sorry. Why didn't somebody say something?
There was something in the chat and I was working.
Oh, I don't see the chat. I don't see the chat.
I know.
Oh, Zoomies, I am sorry. Okay, here's what we're going to do. Can you see me? You can see it now.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I'm going to go back and you can actually see what we were talking about. Here, let me get this out of the way. See, it's been a few weeks and I've got out of my habit. This is the oldest figure we were talking about. Yeah, this is the oldest figure. And this is the second one we were talking about, the woman of Willendorf. Also about 4 inches high, very typical of the size. The handprints, the wonderful handprints that are found, these made by the Neanderthals. And our pig with more handprints on the side. And finally, this is where we were. I really apologize to the people on Zoom. I forgot to share my screen, so they weren't seeing the screen. They could hear me, but they couldn't see what you could see. Now they can. Okay. The Chauvet Caves. Most famous cave is Lascaux. The Lascaux Caves, of course, discovered in the 1940s, definitely the most famous, the biggest. When we see caves like this, the Lascaux Caves are really quite huge. Caves like this go way, way back. I think I have what happened to here it is. Here's the plan of the Lascaux Caves. Actually, that image on the left really makes me really nervous. I'm claustrophobic, and even just looking at the entrance to a cave like that makes me really nervous. I can't even, thinking about going into that space, I couldn't do it. So thank you, people who did, but no way I could. And here's a plan. And many of these passageways are small. Sometimes you have to get down on your hands and knees to get through. They're dangerous. It's dark. I mean, dark like, you've never seen dark. Like we never see anything that dark. So why would there be these images way, way back in these deep recesses that then will open up into a big room, and then you'll have all of these, horses and giant figures going across, 15 foot across the ceiling. There have been many suggestions. We can't know for sure, but looking at modern day tribal cultures, one of the mainstays of all tribal cultures is rites of passage. The idea of young men in particular going through dangerous rites of passage. So it's been suggested that actually quite a few tribal cultures, when a young boy is of an age to sort of enter into the hunting society or sort of the world of men, they're sort of symbolically abducted and taken away, and often they're blindfolded. It's meant to be a little frightening experience, and then they have to do something dangerous. So it's been suggested that maybe the young men were sort of brought in it's pretty scary and dangerous, and they come back and then they light the torch and you've got all these animals across the screen. I do believe it has to be related to rituals. I think the small figures were related to rituals in some way. This is a period when people really had very little knowledge, for sure, of how and why things work the way they do. Yeah.
Wait, are we in Paleolithic now?
Yeah, we're still in Paleolithic. We're still in Paleolithic.
Okay.
Yeah.
But not Upper Paleolithic.
No, it's all Upper Paleolithic. This is all the late part. So maybe that's it. It's a ritual plays a role. When you don't understand why one year everything is very fertile, the plants are fertile, this is hunter-gatherer culture, this is not a culture, this is a culture where people don't control their world. If you're hunters, you follow the herds when they migrate. If plants are not growing, you have to move to where they are growing. So you don't control your world. You're at the whim of something that you don't understand. Well, maybe if I do something, I can affect that. Maybe if I do this ritual, it'll be a better season. Or maybe if I have these fertility figures and fertility of the animals and people, because human beings were quite fragile for a very, very long time until the numbers got up. And so that's what we think this development of sort of ritual was about. And early on, imagery, whether it's 3D or 2D, plays a role in ritual. And I think it's very important to understand that the very first things we look at and call art were important. This isn't decoration. This is important to people. It means something to people, and their lives were dependent on it. Possibly in their minds, their lives might depend on these rituals. One reason that we think it may be rituals, is some of the cave walls have little sort of chips on the walls, as if projectiles had been hurled at them. So maybe they threw spears or something at the wall, at the animals. Maybe that was part of the ritual before a hunt. Maybe it's not a rite of passage. Maybe it's something you do before you go out on every hunt. Maybe it would help. Or it's a way you commune with the animals before you go out. We don't know. You could think of a lot of different possibilities. Okay, this ends for very good reasons. The old Stone Age ends, the world changed dramatically when the last ice age ends. The last ice age ends between 9,000 and 8,000 BCE. When the ice begins to melt, the world changes dramatically. A lot of the animals that were hunted in the late period die out. Things like the mammoth, the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, a lot of the larger animals are gone. With the ice gone, we have a very different world. It's the beginning, it's what we call the Neolithic Revolution. Neolithic means new Stone Age. It's still the Stone Age. Revolution means rapid change. Rapid is a relative term. 1,000 years is maybe not something we would consider rapid change, but at that time it was. So what happens? It's a sequence of events. It's like dominoes falling. Event 1, the ice melts. That causes the next age. Animals disappear. But what begins now, because the ice is gone, is agriculture and animal husbandry. Once they learn to grow their own crops and raise their own animals, they don't need to hunt and gather. I have the animals I need. I raise them myself. And it changes life really dramatically. First of all, you can stay put and start building homes and villages. You don't have to, when you're semi-nomadic and you're following the herds, you're never going to own too many things. You're not going to build yourself big cities. You're not going to own a lot of things. You have to pick them all up and carry them with you. But when you stay put, you can start accumulating things. We are not that different. You move to a bigger house, what do? You fill it up, right? You accumulate. whatever is space you have, you will fill it. That's one of those laws that human beings will do. But this changes life dramatically. The biggest difference is with agriculture and animal husbandry, what that means is it no longer requires 100% of the population to feed everybody. If now only 75% of the men have to work at feeding everybody, that means 25% can do something else. If only 75% of the women have to do whatever, now they're free. And that brings a different level, what we consider a different cultural level, and it brings about specialty. Specialization happens now. With specialization, permanent fixed communities, it begins what we call making. People can start making things. They can build houses. They can make ceramics. They can make furniture. They can make things. And you've now freed up people to do that. So we're starting to see a very different kind of community. And therefore, daily life's no longer about fertility in quite the same way that it was before. I can start, instead of functioning at this very base level of existence, I can move up a level and start thinking about other things. And this is when we see them thinking more about, well, first of all, of course, raising animals and raising crops. You have to think about that, but also the idea of cycles, life and death, what happens after I die. There's really no conception of what we would call religion prior to this. But once you start thinking about what happens when I die, and you start having elaborate burials, and you start thinking about cycles for animal husbandry, cycles for agriculture, cycles for human life, things change. And the most famous Neolithic monument that we have is Stonehenge. It was constructed in the late Neolithic period in Britain and continued into the Bronze Age. There are a lot of myth about Stonehenge. Many things that we've talked about for forever are really not true, and I want to clarify some of those. First of all, the idea of when things happen, like when does the Neolithic period happen, understand it doesn't actually happen at the same time everywhere. In the same way that, as I just said, there were Stone Age cultures not that long ago, and there may even still be. In Britain, the Neolithic happens a little bit later. 3000, most of the rest of the world has come out of the Neolithic period. Britain is a little more isolated. So it begins in the late Neolithic. Now, you notice 3000 to 1500 BCE is a date for when it is constructed. That's a very long time to be building something. And what that means is it's actually constructed over a long period of time by a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. This is not one monumental, simple thing that has one simple explanation. It's more complicated than that. Who built it? I'll tell you who didn't build it. The Druids didn't build it because there's no such thing as the Druids. Much of the mythology about Stonehenge comes from the 19th century. The Victorians were obsessed with this site, and they created like this new Druid religion, and they invented rituals and made stories about it, most of which aren't true at all. It's also not Celtic. The Celts, who do play a very important role in Britain, don't arrive on the island until around 1000 BCE. So they don't need, there's no Celts. The only people in Britain at this time are what we call the ancient Britons. They're the descendants of the earliest Neolithic people who lived on the island, and they're just called ancient Britons. All these other tribal groups that we will encounter when we come to the Middle Ages and later, they come later. Those people come later. The Celts and the Picts and the Saxons and all, they're all much, much later. This is just ancient Britons. And as I said, built over a long period. We know there were approximately 8 different phases over this period. It's also been restructured many times. Stones have been moved and restructured. The image on the left is sort of roughly what we, more or less what it looks like today. This is the whole circle, most of which you don't see today. It's largely disappeared. The larger circle, there's a big ditch that goes around it, a deep ditch around it, and then these what are called Aubrey holes. 56 of the big Aubrey holes are just holes that would have originally had posts in them. Some people believe that at various times it was likely covered. It may have been an actual building at some point, probably with like thatch roofing over it. No way to know that for sure. What we really have today is just this inner section. And we know that about 2,500, the sarsen stones were added, and those are the sarsen is a gray sandstone material brought into the region. That's the outer circle that you see here. If I can find my cursor, these are the sarsen stones, and the great trilithons. Lith means stone, so trilithons are the big 3 stone groups, the giant figures here. There are 5 groups of them. Those are also sarsen, so they come about the same time. There's a series of what are called blue stones. Originally, they were a circle, but then at some point, they were moved to create this horseshoe. So these are the same stones. This is where they used to be, and this is where they are now. So those have been moved. There is the heel stone. Let me see if we have the heel stone here. Out here, there's a stone called the heel. We call it the heel stone. And there's also a stone in the middle that we call the altar stone, although there's no reason to think it was really ever an altar for anything. Victorians just named it because they wanted that. Now, it does mark, you can identify the summer solstice from this. The sun rises behind the heel stone on the summer solstice from the center. So we do know that the rituals that would have taken place here would have related to the summer solstice. But the old idea that it's a calendar, that all of this was built so that you would know when it's the summer solstice, has largely been completely, ignored. Nobody believes that anymore. After all, this was a lot of work, a lot of trouble, and very difficult to build. And if you really just want to know when the summer solstice is, all you have to do is put 2 sticks in the ground. You don't need to build something like this just to know when the sun is in a certain place. There are a lot easier ways to do that. Clearly, it's more complicated than that. Wait, I'm going to move this. There we go. That might help a bit. Okay, so here's the center that we see today. These are the outer sarsen, the inner blue stones, and then the great trilithons. They reflect an architectural system called the post and lintel system, and we'll talk more about that when we look at architecture. Basically, post and lintel just means you have vertical elements and then a horizontal element across from it. It's the simplest way to build something. It's the simplest and earliest architectural form, and it's clearly not the only way to build something, but nonetheless, you get a sense of scale. The blue stones, interestingly, come from Wales. They were brought from Wales very early on. They come from a sacred mountain in Wales, so they were chosen for some reason. They were considered important stones, and it's led people to believe that some of the original builders did come from the West, probably came from Wales. What in terms of what we have today, how would this have functioned? Well, a lot of work has been done on Stonehenge in the last 10 years, and there have been wonderful discoveries that have come out, including things in the last 4 years that have really added to the scholarship on Stonehenge. So it's an exciting time for people interested in Stonehenge. One of the things we have found is the remains of a lot of settlements all around Stonehenge, temporary settlements. round huts that were built. You find archaeologists, one thing we learned in archaeology, and I was an archaeologist before I was an art historian, one of the things you do as an archaeologist, you hunt for the garbage dump. That's what archaeologists want to find. You want to find that trash dump because that's where all the information is. That's where everything you can learn about a people is going to be found there. What they ate, the utensils they use, I mean, everything. The garbage dump is like a gold mine for archaeology. And what, garbage dumps I've told us about Stonehenge is that people came periodically and lived here once a year for a brief period, for maybe 2 weeks. This whole settlement of thousands of people grew up around here. We know they feasted intensely for 2 weeks. We know they brought animals with them from far away because there are bones and the remains of animals that weren't in this area, but they were brought maybe from way up north or whatever. Undoubtedly, this centered on the summer solstice. So we've known that for a while. But within the last 10 years, they've discovered an area a little more than a mile away. This is Stonehenge right down here. This little circle right here is our little Stonehenge. And by the way, henge means circle. Stonehenge, stone circle, that's all it means. They've discovered another circle up here, a little over a mile away, made of wood. It's harder to find because it's not stone. It takes more work to find the remains of wooden things. It's much, much larger. The henge was much, much larger. And the village that grew around it is known as Durrington Walls. It's what we call it. And we named that Woodhenge because it is a wooden circle. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about materials. Why one people use wood, use stone. Stone has certain properties that have always been attractive. Stone is permanent, it's hard, it's almost like immortal, it's powerful, it has associations. Wood, on the other hand, is natural, it's organic, it's temporary, it has a very different meaning. So we now refer to this Woodhenge area around Durrington Walls is referred to as the domain of the living, while Stonehenge down there is known as the domain of the ancestors or the domain of the dead. This river is the River Avon. And as part of the excavation, they've excavated in the river. And one of the things they found all around in the river are remains, human bones, remains all over. And there are burial mounds. We found hundreds and hundreds of burial sites all around Stonehenge. Now, what seems to have happened is once a year they practice cremation. So when someone died, they would be cremated. And once a year at summer solstice, everyone comes to Stonehenge, or Woodhenge, comes together, and you have ceremonies. And at the time of the summer solstice, then you get on boats and sail down the Avon River. And there's a spot right here where you would get off and a trail that would go up to Stonehenge. And while you're in the river, you would pour into the river the cremated remains of your loved ones who had died that year as part of the ceremonial practice. And then you go up to Stonehenge, the domain of the ancestors or the domain of the dead. So it's a symbolic moment. It's all about death and life after death and how to treat, your ancestors when they die. And so you would come and go through this ceremony. Certainly the burials around Stonehenge would be of the elite, the important people. The people dumped in the river, or just everybody else gets, but you're in a sacred space, you're in a sacred place. But it's a high level thinking about death and about the human remains and the body. But I have to tell you what we have found, and I keep saying we because I identify, but obviously I wasn't there. In 2020, another circle was found, the biggest one yet. That is the circle. That's the circle, that big mark. It's 2 kilometers in diameter, or 1.2 miles in diameter. So Stonehenge is tiny, Woodhenge look big, and now we've got this, which I'm not sure they've named it yet. The circle is created and inscribed by 20 huge, deep shafts that have been found, that once they dug them out, they identified this massive, 1 mile circle. The pits that they found are 30 foot across and 16 foot deep. And they date to about 2500. So they weren't there right from the beginning, but this is early days. Nobody has any idea what this is about or what those pits were for. Some of these smaller circles, you could imagine there were huge, columns in there or something, but these are way too big to have been columns. They're 30 foot across. So what they signify, what they were, what more they're going to find. At this point, they're just saying it probably identified a sacred precinct of some kind, but at this point, we don't know more. Stay tuned. Maybe they'll know more about it as they find more, but we don't know. It's just the newest. When you find something from 2020, that's how active this site still is, and it's really exciting because they're finding so many new things. Yes.
What were the shafts made of?
Well, they're just holes in the ground. Oh. They're holes. They're just big, empty holes in the ground. I'm not sure of the detail. What I've read published didn't go into a lot of that detail. I suspect it was filled up with over time, and then in digging, they this looks like a hole, and they start digging and realize it's is identified this big shaft. But as far as I know, there's no remains or anything in those pits. It's not like they were tombs. They would have certainly published that information if there'd been bones or whatever in them. So don't know, just don't know. No, we are not going to ascribe. We are not going to ascribe them to UFOs, although that has been done on many occasions. Everything we don't know isn't UFOs. Yes.
So you said something a while back that I want to ask you about when you were talking about the Neolithic Revolution, and you were talking, the last thing was an increased interest in cycles of life and death. And you said there were no known religions prior to this.
Yeah, they weren't religions in our. There's no reference. There doesn't seem to be any gods, goddesses. The only sort of human figures depicted in the Paleolithic are those early little nature figures. And we don't really have any reason to think they thought of that as a goddess per se. We would need more than what we have to think of that. So there's at this point, there's really no conception of that. We haven't come up with that at this point. Yeah, as far as we know. It's tricky identifying, defining and identifying that, but usually there would be some. And of all the caves, Paleolithic, there are almost no human figures. It's all animals. There are almost no. Some humans show up in Neolithic cave art. The very last things that are done maybe have like a hunter in the midst of animals, but mostly it's just animals. So no people at all. Okay. As we move out of the Stone Age, around 3000, and this is true around the world, we start seeing roughly around 3000 BCE, the development of what we call civilization. That's a tricky word. Did my microphone just go off? Probably ran the battery down. Probably wasn't charged. We'll see if there's another one up there if this one goes out. What do we mean by civilization? Everybody doesn't define it exactly the same way. It's somewhat arbitrary. It's a level of social development that identifies hierarchy. It's a complexity of society. Tribal groups might have one leader, but when we come to this new period, we enter what's called stopped again. Let's see if this other one is charged.
Better?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is this gonna work? This is better. Probably just needed charging. Okay, so it's a new level of complexity and hierarchy. It also is identified as the Bronze Age, the beginning of metal. All over the world, the first metal that people use, the first metallurgy, it's always bronze. We'll talk about that when we get there. We're going to look at 3 different areas in the Eastern Mediterranean that developed early civilizations and kingdoms. And that's going to be Egypt, the Near East, and then cultures on the Greek islands that are sort of pre-Greek. So this is where we're going to begin. So let's talk about Egypt first. Egypt is not the earliest. It's overlapping with cultures in the Near East about the same time, by 3100. It's hard to say exactly. So I'm going to turn this up a little bit so I can move. It's dangerous. Okay, is that working? Try and put this back a little further. Okay, let's talk about Egypt. When you look at a map of Egypt, then and now, it looks like a big rectangular country. In reality, Egypt is a fairly narrow area on either side of the Nile. The rest of it is desert with nomads, and that hasn't changed all that much. The major population of Egypt lives right along the Nile. That's simply the nature of the climate. We're not going to go into Egyptian mythology that much because I don't know it that much, but I'll give you a little bit about just their origin story, because we're going to see a couple of the gods and other figures. And for those of you that have the Greek mythology, the Greek and Roman, it's interesting parallels. It's very similar. Heka is the first god. He's considered the god of magic, or just magic in general. And he lived on a hill. He created this primal hill called Benben. That was the name of the hill. And there was a god called Atum. He's not on that list. Atum on the hill. And so he mates with his own shadow and spits out 2 figures, spits out Tefnut and Shu. Tefnut stands for order, and Shu stands for life. And then they go out to create the rest of the world. Well, he's waiting for them. Atum is waiting for them, and he's getting worried about them. So he takes out one of his eyes and sends it out to look for them, and finds them. And then they come back and they bring him back his eye. And that's the origin of the Eye of Udjat, if you've ever seen it, or the Eye of Horus, or that's the origin of the story. It's Atum took his eye out to go find them. So they come back, and they're brother and sister, but they consort and give birth to Geb and Nut, and that's earth and sky. And that's where it should start sounding familiar if you remember Greek mythology. The earth mother and the sky father. They give birth to this first generation. They are the parents of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. It's very similar as we studied in the Greek world of Uranus and Gaia giving birth to Kronos and Rhea, and then Kronos and Rhea give birth to the Olympic gods. So it's very similar. You start with sort of nothing, and then you have the sky and the earth. And then they give birth to the first generation of gods, etc. It's a very similar idea. So this is sort of where the gods come from. But most of the stories that you see in art don't deal with that creation story as much as they deal with the story of Osiris and Isis in particular, and Set. So Osiris and Isis were co-rulers of the earth, but Set's brother got very jealous about that. And it's really it's really, I have to tell you this story. He wanted to get rid of his brother Osiris. So he has this chest built. He secretly at night measures Osiris to get his exact dimensions, and he builds this chest, and he has this big party, and he says, whoever fits this chest best wins a prize. So everybody's getting into this big chest, and nobody fits it perfect, but Osiris does, because it was made to fit him perfectly. And the minute he gets inside it, Seth slams the cover shut and throws him in the Nile. And then Seth is ruling. But Isis isn't happy with that. So she and her sister Nephthys go out and they find him. But Seth, they steal him back, and she's trying to figure out how to make him alive again because he's dead. And in the meantime, Set steals him back again, but this time he chops him up and hides pieces of him all over Egypt. And according to one version of the story, there were 42 pieces of Osiris hidden around Egypt. And at that time, there were 42 provinces in ancient Egypt. So one bit of Osiris was everywhere. So again, Isis and Nephthys set out to find all the pieces to put him back together again. So they find all the pieces, and they put him all back together with one piece missing, his penis. Instead, Isis absorbed it. That's how it's usually said. She absorbed it, and that's when she gave birth to Horus. And Horus is a major figure. So Osiris is incomplete. Part of his body is not there. So he can't rule anymore, can't rule the earth anymore. So he goes down to rule the underworld, or so that Osiris is the ruler of the underworld now at this point, and Horus becomes the sort of ruler on earth. Isis and Nephthys, Egyptian gods and goddesses are really complicated because they merge together. One will be like there's an Amun and there's a Ra, but there's also an Amun Ra. And there's an Atem and a Ra, but there's also an Atem Ra, and they'll merge together and become one being, and then they're separate beings. It gets very complicated, much more than the Greek even, and that was pretty complicated. So the only other thing I want to talk about is Mot. Mot is not a god or a goddess. Mot means harmony and balance, and Mot rules everything in Egypt, the idea of balance and harmony. And we're going to see it in the art. We see it in stories. Horus, of course, will encounter, Ra will encounter Anubis. Amun usually encounter more in terms of Amun Ra when he merges with Ra, and they become something else. We'll see a temple to Amun and Amun Ra. So we will encounter them. Yes.
What was the name of the eye?
The eye, it's sometimes called the eye of the Hedjut, Hedjut, or also just the eye of Horus. It's called the eye of Horus sometimes.
Eye of who?
Horus. 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 Sometimes it's called the Eye of Horus. This is that confusing Egyptian god thing. But you see the eye everywhere in imagery. Okay, on this map, in the north, in Lower Egypt, in the north, early on in the early dynasties, this is where the capital is. In later periods, it moves south, and later capitals by the New Kingdom are going to be down here in the south. So we're going to see and talk about why they move. One thing we see in Egyptian art is to most people's eye, it looks like it never changes. You can look at Old Kingdom art and New Kingdom art 2,500 years apart, and they'll look exactly the same. In fact, that's what the Greeks said. When the Greeks encountered the Egyptians, they came back and said, they never change. Nothing ever changes. It's always exactly the same. And relative to Greek art, they're absolutely right, because Greek art's going to change really, really quickly. And you can see difference of 5 years in Greek art in many periods. But Egyptian, it's the same. And that's because that meant something to them. Tradition means something. First, you don't mess with tradition. And also, it's not really rigid. Sometimes they're seen as rigid, but it's order, it's stability and balance, it's Mot. You just don't mess with these things. In two-dimensional art, this is a form you follow. It's called the composite view, and you do not vary from that. This is how an important human being is shown. Now, if you're not important, it matters less that you're shown this way. So if it's a scene with important figures and then some slaves running around, those figures might be quite dynamic. They're not shown like this at all. But if you're important, you're shown like this. From the waist down, you're shown in profile. The legs are seen in profile with one leg in front of the other. From the waist up, you're seen, at least up to the shoulders, you're seen frontally, and then the head is in profile with the eye frontal. The eye is like moved around to the side, so you don't see the eye from the side front, you see it from the side. Now, why this particular view? It's because it's the most recognizable view of the human form. You recognize the legs and feet best from the side and profile. You recognize the torso from the front, because you can see the shoulders. The head you see in profile, and the eye from the front. Because Egyptian art has nothing to do with what something looks like. They're not concerned at all with what a person looked like or what anything looks like. They're concerned with communicating information. How do I communicate a human being? You're not going to miss that this is a human being. So it's all about information. Nobody's concerned with what something looks like. I have a diagram here of the two crowns. Early on, prior to the dynastic period, Egypt was divided into really two kingdoms, one in the north and one in the south. There was Upper Egypt, which was in the south, and Lower Egypt, which is in the north. Why is that? Sounds wrong, right? Sounds like it should be the other way around. Up, down. The Nile, right? It's because the Nile flows north. The Nile is the only major river in the world that flows north. Major river. The only one. So upper means upstream. So that's in the south, and lower. It's hard to get that in your head. It's really, I struggled with it for like many decades, and I still have to stop and really think before it comes out of my mouth, because it's so ingrained that that's up and that's down, but that's not up, that's up. You know, you got to remember up, and that's not an easy thing to do, but that's why. So two crowns for two kings will merge into the double crown, which is quite literally overlaying one over the other. Now, when does that merging take place? It takes place right around 3000 BCE. And the first king of this period, the one who's responsible for the unification of Egypt, is named Narmer. This is a very important palette. It's known as the Palette of Narmer. It's 2 foot high. It's a ceremonial version of an actual object which people would have had in their homes and used every day, but much smaller versions. You're seeing two sides of the same thing. That's what you're seeing here, the front and the back of this stone palette. On the right is actually the front, because you see that little circle, that well in the middle, that is where you would mix charcoal and water, where you would mix eye makeup. So a small palette in your home would be where you would mix for eye makeup. The Egyptians would use a very, very fine ground charcoal and put it in your eye. Now, in movies, they paint like eye makeup around the outside of the eye, but that's not what the Egyptians did. They did do that, but they also put it in the eye. And lest you think that sounds awful, it's actually really, really good for your eye. It cleans them out, and it's a very fine powder. If you've ever touched, ladies, if you've ever been putting on mascara and you get a little in your eye, right, it floats to the outside. So if you put in a really fine charcoal powder, it would float to the outside and make a ring around your eye, like makeup. And it's very fun. And the white of your eye, you have no feeling in the white of your eye. The painful part is when you get to the iris, that's where it can hurt. But the white, there's no feeling at all. So you wouldn't feel it. And it's really actually very healthy for your eye, because that charcoal just cleans and keeps everything out of your eye. So this is where you mix it. Now, this particular palette, being 2 foot high, is purely ceremonial. It's from a temple. There would have been a sculpture of a god in the temple, and the priests would, as a ceremony, would mix the charcoal in this big oversized palette and then paint it on the sculpture of the god. So it's a ceremonial object that does relate to the real thing.
So does this represent the upper and the lower?
Yep, let's take a look at the details and see what is happening here, because this tells us the whole story of the unification. Let's start with, on the left, that is Narmer, and he was from Upper Egypt in the south. That's where he was from. And we see him standing on his own ground line with this big club in his hand, and he's about to club this other figure who is actually quite large, not as big as him, but quite large. So it probably represents the king of Lower Egypt that he defeats. Now, notice the discrepancies of scale. The Egyptians used what is called hierarchical scale, which means the more important you are, the bigger you are. This is how they tell you who is who in a work of art. Really big, you're important. Really tiny, you're not. And your relative importance is clearly shown here. So both of those are fairly big guys. Narmer, of course, is the biggest. He's the most important. And so we see him here with the club. They're also obsessively controlling the space. One of the things we're going to be talking about in art, in visual art, is the idea of a narrative in art. There were no narratives in Stone Age art. Now, what I mean by that is a narrative is storytelling. When you tell a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's something that unfolds in time. Those cave walls were not narratives. They were just, here's an animal, here's an animal. It wasn't like, I went on the hunt this morning and here's what I did, and then I did this, and then I did that, and then I came home. It wasn't that. There's no narratives. This is when narratives begin, storytelling visually. The only problem is that the visual arts are not a very good medium for storytelling. If you want to tell a story, better medium would be literature or theater. Those are time-based arts. It's easy to tell a story if you're writing it because it unfolds over time and you read it over time. A book has a beginning and a middle and an end, just like the story you're telling in the book. So it's natural. But an image like this is fixed. It's fixed in time. So if you're telling a narrative, you have options. First of all, you have to, if you're only going to show one image, you have to decide, well, what moment in this story should I depict? And this is their way of taking multiple moments from a single story, but they're Egyptian, so they have to organize it really well. And they break it into these registers. A register is just this band. Like the one on the left has 3 registers, a lower, a middle, and then an upper. The one on the right has 1, 2, 3, 4 registers. But everybody gets their own little ground line to stand on. It's a way of organizing space. It's not natural at all. I mean, it has nothing to do with what anyone would have seen if you were there. It's about information, and scale is giving you information, as are other symbols. That lower register on the left, 2 fallen enemies, and then that little square by them is the view of a city from above, like you're looking down at a city. So just like the composite view, they're not afraid to change your point of view to make something more readable. What's the best way to read city walls? Well, from above, it looks like a square. So they give you that little square of a city from above. So fallen enemies and a city. The guy behind Narmer would be his servant. He's carrying sandals, which identify this as holy ground. Narmer has taken off his shoes. His servant is carrying them. Above the fallen enemy is this wonderful little symbol of Lower Egypt. That's a papyrus plant. These are papyrus, they grow in the Delta area, and they're the symbol of Lower Egypt. And that's Horus above him. And it always looks to me like he has this hook, like he's hooking him by the nose. But everything I read about it says he has a rope around the neck of Lower Egypt. So that's Lower Egypt, and clearly has fallen. So on this side alone, you can see who's won the battle. You can see that it's a battle between Upper and Lower Egypt, because he's wearing the crown of one. We have the symbol of the other, which is clearly defeated. Horus is showing us that. So we already know from that the story of who fought and who won. The upper register, we have two images of Hathor, the cow goddess Hathor, and she's really complicated, so I don't even want to go into that. Sometimes she's linked with Isis, sometimes she's the father of Horus, sometimes she's actually linked with Io. And I'm saying this for those of you that had Greek art. Remember Io in Greek art, who was abducted, ended up in Egypt? Well, she was a cow, right? Zeus turned her into a cow. If you didn't have the class, this sounds weird, but she was turned into a cow and found her way to Egypt. Those stories get all mixed up in Greek and Egyptian mythology. So Hathor is way complicated. In between Hathor is this little symbol that has Narmer's name. There's actually a horizontal fish that's meant to be a horizontal fish, and a vertical chisel. In ancient Egyptians, the name of a fish is Nar, and the name of a chisel is Mer. So Narmer is his name, and that tells us what his name is. Isn't that interesting? And the other little squares around it are two different points of view of another city, walls looking down and a front entrance gate. It's hard to read it, but everything there has meaning. On the right, we see more, the bottom register, we see the bull. Now, Narmer is often associated with the bull. Bulls, in many cultures, we're going to see symbolize power and strength, and are linked to the king. They're powerful creatures. He's actually wearing a bull's tail. If you look at the big Narmer on the left, see that thing hanging from his belt? That's meant to be the tail of a bull. And the bull on the lower register on the far right is the symbol, symbolizes Narmer, again, a powerful king who's crushing an enemy. And again, you see another city, sort of reinforced walls vertically around a city. The big register in the middle that holds that well, you see two lionesses with these giant necks that wrap around each other, clearly symbolizing unification. Two great beasts that are now unified into one. And then I love the next register up. That's one of my favorites. You see Narmer on the left, now wearing the crown, the red crown of Lower Egypt, because now he's conquered it. With a servant behind him. Right in front of his face is another symbol of his name. That's another horizontal fish and a vertical chisel, Nar-mer, right in front of his face. And then various soldiers and others carrying banners and the like, clearly not very important. And then on the far right, we have this wonderful view. Can you see what those are? I know it's hard to tell. Dead people, those are the defeated people, but they're missing something. Their heads are actually laying between their feet. See that they've been beheaded. Now, they're shown in an odd way. They're shown as if they're like sideways laying on their shoulders, but we have to understand this is Egypt. This is what you would see if you were above them looking down. Right? If they were laid out on the ground and you were above them looking down. So you're seeing one part of the image is a procession that you're seeing from the side, but the other part of the image on the far side is an image you're seeing from above, looking down on all of the defeated enemies with their heads between their feet. So it's perfect for, it's terrible if you're going to argue this is realism. Like, no, it's not. It makes no sense spatially, but it's wonderful for communicating information. Everything is shown from exactly the point of view that gives you the most information about what you're seeing.
Where is this?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where this is right now. But we'll come back to this actually a little later when I show you something else. We'll compare it. Now, in terms of architecture, we're familiar with the pyramids, but the pyramids don't just appear out of nothing. It begins and is influenced by the burial practices of the Egyptians. And it begins with the mastabas. Mastabas, that's when you see right there, typical sort of burial structures. And you see one below. It would have had, it's basically a rectangle with the walls slanting inward. All the walls slant slightly inward. And no one is buried in it. You were buried below a mastaba, and there would have been a shaft dug down, you were buried underground, and then the shaft is filled in. And then within the building, there would have been a chamber which would be sealed off. And in that chamber would be a sculpture symbolizing the person. That's called the Ka sculpture. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Here's the shaft. This is the little room inside it. That there would be a little sculpture in there, and then that room would be sealed off. And then there's another outer room, a sort of chapel, they call it a chapel. But when the ceremony takes place, when someone dies, there would be a little altar, and the family would come and leave flowers, whatever. But you could actually enter that chapel, later if you want to go visit them every year, whatever. So that's open. But the room that holds the sculpture here, that's sealed off. You can't get to that. And it's where the Ka sculpture is held. The Egyptians believed in multiple souls, that you have multiple souls, and that, yes, when you die, one will go to be with the gods. The other stays on earth and needs to be preserved. This is really the reason for mummification and the extremes of preservation and the like. You need something, and that Ka can dwell in any sort of image of the person. If you make it could be a sculpture, it could be a painting. There are all sorts of different things that soul could dwell in, but it needs to be preserved. It needs to not be desecrated, not be destroyed or stolen, and often part of it dwells with the body as well. So mummification is part of it. So that was early on, and mastabas continue to be the primary burial chambers for most people, ordinary people. But after 3000, when we get into the dynastic period in the first and second dynasties, they wanted more. The kings were becoming more important and more powerful. And they started stacking mastabas. I want a bigger one. So here's a mastaba. Let's put a smaller one on top. And then let's put a smaller one on top and a smaller one on top. And pretty soon you have a kind of wedding cake of mastabas. And that's where the step pyramid begins. The first form is a stepped pyramid, which is basically just a stack of mastabas, one on top of the other. And we have one really famous one, but they were still buried underground, and it was still very much the same thing. It's just stacking them up.
So there'd be a different shaft for each one of those?
No, that'd be one person. This whole thing is for one person. This is for the king. There's only one of these.
Okay, so then what do these additional?
They just make bigger. They just make a bigger structure. But there's really only one burial. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, but I want to go back to that idea. You said there's like two souls, one soul that goes up into what?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when we come to the pyramids. But the idea of an afterlife is also tricky to understand. Egypt's tricky to understand because almost everything we know is about kings and powerful people. We don't have a lot of information about ordinary people and what they believed and what they thought happened after this. So we tend to tell the stories that we know, and we only really know a little bit and about a certain cultural group. So I'm not really sure what an ordinary person thought happened to their soul, because nobody talked about that. What they talked about was what mattered. The king mattered because your chances of an afterlife hinged on your relationship to the king. The closer you were to the king, the more important you were, the greater the chances of your afterlife. So everything is seen in terms of this one person, this one powerful person. But the masses of other people, things weren't preserved, and we just don't know. Yeah.
Were there not ruins of like cities or settlements from that period that give you some insight into the common people?
Well, we have necropolises. The problem was we don't have a lot in the cities because the modern cities have replaced them. I mean, Giza then is Cairo, they're all built on top of each other. So it's not like there's some ruin out there untouched that we can go excavate. It's like trying to deal with Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, by the way, is Mexico City, literally is this, and so they're constantly, someone puts in a basement and you discover some ancient Aztec site. I mean, it's kind of tricky like that. I saw another, yeah.
When you said the mastabas were for ordinary people, you didn't really mean ordinary.
I meant, yes, you're right. I meant like
no
the mastabas that we know about that are built around the pyramids are there because they're the tombs of like the craftsmen who built the pyramids. And they were of a higher status than like the slaves.
Or like the queen.
Well,
okay.
We don't know. We know more about the women later. We know more about the women by the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom. Women are really present by then. Because women fare quite well in ancient Egypt, better than anywhere else in the ancient world. But Old Kingdom, not so much. So once you get a step pyramid, it's a simple step, if you pardon that, to sort of fill in the sides. And when you fill in the sides, you get what we're used to as a pyramid here. So these would have been constructed very much like a step pyramid, and then you just fill it in. There was we're not seeing it as they were originally. There would have been a limestone like covering to this on all the sides that we're told was highly polished. These were apparently like glass. There are Greeks who visited them, and like the sun, because these are associated with Ra, the sun god. And in fact, the angles are like the rays of the sun coming down. That's what they're meant to symbolize. So they were highly polished and highly reflective. It would have been about 30 feet tall or about 30 feet bigger all around, and not what we see at all. Probably closer to the pyramid in Memphis. Anybody been to Memphis and seen that? Tennessee, I mean, not Memphis in Egypt, but that's why they put it there. If you want to see the Parthenon and the pyramids, you just got to go to Tennessee. Nashville has one and Memphis has the other. And I'll talk to you about that later, because I've been to one, but not the other. Okay, so there are many pyramids in Egypt, but there are 3 that we call the Great Pyramids. These are them, the 3 largest. They are from the 4th dynasty, and they are the burial tombs for the 3 most powerful kings sequentially. Of that period, it's each one in order. Khufu, Khafra, well, that's and Menkaura, and it's the father, son, son. There's 3 generations of rulers. Khufu is the earliest one. That's the biggest. His son, Khafra is next, the slightly smaller, and then the 3rd is Menkaura. Building pyramids like this only really lasts for a short period. In the Old Kingdom, which is the early period. And we'll talk about why they stopped doing this for very good reasons. Of course, something like this would be something you would start when you were very young, because it would take, you know, your whole lifetime to get it built. When we look at, let me see, I'm going to come back to that in a second. No, I don't have it. I'll show you an interior, a cutaway view in a minute, but this is more or less a solid object. There are passages, there are individual passages that go up into it and down. And as I said, I'll show you the cutaway view. But within the tomb itself, which is buried up here in the center, there were these shafts. They're about this big, a square shaft that is cut straight up the side and goes right out to the edge. And we used to always call them air shafts. In fact, even on diagrams today, they're still labeled air shaft ? We thought, well, those are shafts that were cut so the workers could, you know, breathe. But not all that long ago, a few decades ago, someone discovered that on an auspicious day, the air shafts all point to one spot in the sky, which we know of as the Belt of Orion, which happens to be where they believed the spirit or soul of the king went after death. So now we're thinking maybe they're not maybe they were, yeah, they were air shafts, but they were also the shaft for the soul of the king to sort of rise up from the tomb right up into the Belt of Orion, which is really interesting. The other thing I would point out is you can see how they're placed in relation to one another. They're not in a line. In fact, look at the 3 stars in the Belt of Orion. That is exactly the placement of those 3 great pyramids. It's how they relate to one another, which nobody noticed for a very long time either. And when they discovered that, they went, maybe let's take a look. Let's measure that. Well, wow, that's where they're placed. So maybe we don't have anything in writing that says that, but that is the exact placement of the tomb. So it makes sense that they might have done that. The pyramids were part of a whole necropolis, which is basically just a Greek word for city of the dead. It's a complex of mastabas, hundreds and hundreds of mastabas, but also these long causeways that led to funerary temples. Now, where a mastaba had a burial tomb under it in the ground and the sort of funerary temple inside the building, those functions have been separated. You have the burial now in the middle of the pyramid, but the funerary temple that would hold the sculpture and the place where you could, you know, sort of visit their soul or whatever is now separated from it in a temple, and they're connected by a long causeway. So we're getting 2 different functions broadly separated. Here's a cutaway view. Now, there is an underground shaft, and it's labeled here original burial chambers. Some people said that, well, this is just a false chamber so that anyone breaking in would think that's the burial chamber underground, because that's what they were used to, and they dig down there. Other people say no, they just changed their mind, that they dug that because they were going to bury it underground, just like they always had been, but decided that wasn't safe enough, and so changed their mind. So there's a sort of a false burial chamber underground. The real burial chamber is located way up here, and there's this massive gallery. Now these are, one of those is sort of the air shaft that leads to Orion. Now, the reality is all 3 of these were looted. The whole idea for this is protection. You've got to protect that mummy. You've got to protect all those sacred objects for your soul to continue living, to live in the afterlife. So for protection, it didn't work. I mean, you'd think this is, you know, how do you get into something like this? Don't ask me. I don't quite know how they did it, but it was done before the New Kingdom. This wasn't done centuries later. This was done during the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. You know, Egypt has an Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. It was done in the Middle Kingdom. So Egyptians weren't afraid of looting these things. And it's one of the problems with them, and one reason why they will abandon this idea of a pyramid. You want it to be safe, but you want this, because you've got a big ego and you're a king who thinks he's a living God, you want this massive memorial to yourself. Well, maybe it's not a good idea to put this thing out here and say, look, this is full of gold and all sorts of things, but you'll never get in it. I mean, they decided that wasn't a very good idea. So they will abandon that in the New Kingdom, and we'll talk about that. And tombs are simple to get into in the New Kingdom. You just can't find them. And it ended up being a much better idea. Yes.
Is that a little pyramid?
In front of it?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. There are little ones. A later king, obviously, I don't know why anyone would want to build themselves a little. If you're a king and you've got those three, you either build a bigger one or you don't do it. I mean, why would you build this little thing and say, I'm not as important as these guys were? But, you know, I don't know. It's a symbol of Ra, so it has all kinds of, the pyramid has all sorts of other symbolic importance as well. But they're big. The base is about the size of 2 football fields. You'll see that I measure everything in terms of football fields, because if I say 300 feet, it's really hard for most people to know what that is. But if I say a football field, everybody's got an image of what that is. So I talk in terms of football fields, and I find that works really well in terms of people understanding what I'm trying to say. The sculpture for Khafre, who is the second of the 3 in the second largest pyramid, the sculpture that was in his funerary temple is this, one of the most famous sculptures. It is the classic example of Old Kingdom Egyptian art. It's over life size, 5'6", but then he's sitting. If he stood up, he would be over life size. Most Egyptian sculpture is monumental. Monumental is simply a term we use for meaning over life size, or way over. Some of them are 20, 30 feet tall. This is the 3-dimensional version of the composite view. You know, if you're doing a painting on a wall and you twist and turn the body in a certain way, how do you translate that into a 3-dimensional form? Because that's different. And this is how you do it. There were 2 ways you could show a human form, one seated and one standing, and I'll show you the standing in a minute, but this is how you do a seated figure. It's sometimes referred to as a cubic perspective. And what I mean by that, actually a colleague of mine made up that name and I've been using it ever since. So we're probably the only 2 art historians that use the term, but I love it because it's a perfect description, because it's made out of what was a huge rectangular block of stone. And then they literally carved each of the 4 sides one at a time. It's conceptualized 2-dimensionally. It may be 3-dimensional, but they didn't think of it 3-dimensionally. It's not like an in the round. It's not like they're moving all around it. It's still very rectangular. You can see in your mind the rectangle it's carved from. You know, it's not like trying to hide that. It's very rigid to, 4 sides. It's also in what we call the closed style, meaning there are no open spaces in this sculpture. If you look like between the legs, or behind the legs, between the arms, it's completely connected to the stone. There's no cutouts. There's no open areas. It's solidly attached to the stone. And they could have cut that out, but they don't. So it's a choice. So then you have to ask, why did they do that? What difference does it make? Well, it actually connects him to that material. Egyptians loved working in stone. Stone speaks of power and strength. It's almost like immortality. It speaks of immortality. It's the meaning that they use to choose this very, very hard stone called gneiss, which is a very hard stone. And visualize this in wood. Can you visualize this carved in wood? It's very hard to do, actually, but it would be a totally different work of art. It would have a totally different meaning. It would be associated in a totally different way. Wood is alive. it's soft, it changes, it is impermanent. No, this is stone, and not only stone, hard stone. It's a hard blue stone. When the light shines on this, it almost glows with blue. It flickers with this blue light. There's something really magical about it. He's sitting there looking straight out above you. It's very lifelike. It's very naturalistic. Naturalism is a term we use in art to refer to something that looks like a thing. I'll make this clear later, but don't confuse naturalism and realism. We do not use those two words the same way. And if you come from the field of literature, I apologize, because we use it exactly the opposite as the way it's used in literature. And I had many friends in the English department, and we had many discussions about this, but we just use the terms differently. Naturalism means it looks like a thing, but this is naturalistic. It is not realistic. That is not a portrait of him at all. It's not what he looks like. Realism is, there's no realism until we get to the Romans. So not even the Greeks do realism. But it is naturalism. It's very like a person, but a very superior person. I mean, he looks out, above it all.
Where do you find that blue stone? Is that only found in?
It's quarried in Egypt. Yeah, it's magnificent. And then there are symbols of Lower Egypt. There are papyrus and other symbols. He's wearing everything has meaning in Egyptian art. Everything has a meaning. Everything's about information. So he's wearing the cobra headdress. That wonderful thing like this is called a cobra headdress. And it's meant to look like the hood of a cobra, like when a cobra rises up and opens up. That's what it's meant to look like, because cobras were associated with Ra, the sun god. So why would cobras be associated with the sun? What do they both do? They rise up. Isn't that interesting? Cobra rises up just like the sun rises. So they became connected. So that's symbolic. And when we look around the side, we see that he has a little Horus behind him. Yes.
The carving of the stone, as you were talking about, is done from four sides.
Yeah. And it's very squared off.
And it's done simultaneously.
Well, that I couldn't tell you. That I don't know.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. The difference is it's more conceptual than physical. No one conceptualized it. There's no like 3/4 view. It's very squared off. The head is square, the arms are square, the legs are square. So the person is thinking of what it looks like from here, what it looks like from here, here, and here. They're thinking two-dimensionally.
And what did you call that term that you and your colleague use?
Oh, cubic perspective.
And what's the chin?
Oh, yeah, that's another symbol. That is a wooden beard. It's a piece of wood that was tied around their ears, and it's a symbol of the position, a symbol of the position of king. And when we do have female kings later, and women will rule as king, not queen, they will wear the symbolic beard because tradition mattered more than truth. The tradition was more important than the fact that she was a woman and didn't have a beard. That was less important than the fact that the tradition says. And notice I'm calling them kings, not pharaohs. Pharaohs come along later. They're different from a king. There are no pharaohs in the old kingdom. Pharaohs come along with the new kingdom. And we'll talk about the first pharaohs because it actually has a different meaning. These old kingdom kings were all powerful. Later, new kingdom pharaohs are not. It's very different. Their power is diminished later. These are the powerful ones. They are kings. So he would have been holding something in his hand. There's sort of a rolled up piece of fabric in one hand, symbolic of his, don't ask me what, I don't know. But Horus back there with his wings spread around, again, kind of just a god, identifying him and his importance, sort of validating his position and his power. There's Horus, the falcon, ruler of the earth, who's in a sense sort of appointing this man to rule. It speaks to the rightness of his power. We have a nice piece in the Nelson Gallery. Unfortunately, where it's placed is very unfortunate. When you walk into that room, if you go through where the mummies are, and we'll go over there at some point, when you walk into the room, he's kind of on the left, and you walk past him, and unless you stop and turn around and look, you walk right by the guy and don't even know he's there. And it's a real loss. Raware is also from the 4th dynasty, the same time period. He was an official, an important official of the government, not a king, but an important official. And this shows the acceptable standing position. So the seated position is as we saw, and this is the standing position where arms are straight down, attached to the side. It's still the closed style. There's no open air anywhere. His fists are clenched. He's holding symbolic things. In this case, you can't tell from this angle, but he's really standing with all of his weight on the back leg, and the front leg is sort of pushed out in front of him. He's not equally balanced. That may seem minor, but it's not. When we come to Greek art, we'll talk more about that, because that's a big difference. That it's a change that the Egyptians will never make. So take a look at this. Not, you know, he's not all there, but it is over life size, and it's a wonderful example of the standing position. Before we move on, I'm not even sure if I put her on the list. I probably did. A little sculpture, seated sculpture from the 5th dynasty, still in the Old Kingdom. This shows Isis, and that's a symbol of the sun, that sun symbol. Now, this is Isis, and it's a combination of gods. It has Hathor's horns and the symbol of Ra, the sun, in between them. So this is sort of when Isis merges with Hathor, because they're both said to be the mothers of Horus. But I show it to you because it's an archetypal image that will be passed down historically. The idea of an enthroned woman holding her child, and it becomes a model for all of those enthroned virgin and child images that we get in the Middle Ages. This is where they come from. It's an archetypal image that runs through Egypt and is picked up later. I mean, when you've got the perfect image, why reinvent one? I mean, if this is the perfect mother-child image, you just keep doing it.
Do you think that this is one of the earliest images of the mother-child?
This particular piece, it's one of them. I mean, it's certainly Old Kingdom. There may be earlier ones I'm not familiar with, but it's certainly one of the earliest that we know of. And trust me, this is Egyptian, so it has nothing to do with nothing to do with like maternal feelings. This is Egyptian. It's purely informational. She is seated on a throne, and she is his throne. That's an important symbol in Christian imagery too. Mary is often referred to as the throne of Christ, because she's seated on a throne, and then he's seated on her, so she becomes his throne. And that's also what you see here. And in terms of painting, tomb painting, I want to show you this one. There are a lot of striations. I love this one. It's Old Kingdom. T watching a hippo hunt. T, obviously, hierarchical scale. T is the big one. He was in the sort of royal family, but not a king. But one of the obligations of the royal family was to lead the hippo hunts in the Nile every year. Hippopotami are recognized as the most dangerous animal in Africa. They were and still are. They're deadly. They kill more people than any other animal. And so once a year, they would have these hippo hunts in the Nile and try and kill as many as they could to sort of weed them out, because they were killing people and whatever. And the royal family's responsibility was to do that. So he's leading the hippo hunt. That's what's happening here. And you see, notice these little guys down here who would have been slaves or servants. Now they're much more dynamic. They're not in a stiff position at all. They're moving and interesting angles. That's because they're not important. They don't need to be in that composite view, but he does. So it almost looks like two totally different styles of painting. They are, because it's two different types of people. All of this up here, all these vertical striations that have been carved into the wall, those are meant to signify papyrus reeds. So the tall papyrus reeds, he's on a little reed boat going through the papyrus reeds in the delta. And then these are the tops of them. And notice there's a fox up here and there are birds. And, so Egyptian art can be very lively and very active. It's just that we don't see a lot of images that allow for that. We tend to mostly see these very formal images of kings. And of course, they're going to be very stiff and look like that. But notice the variation. I also love, whoops, try that again. Below the boat, you have, see these squiggly, that's the water. And then you have fish and hippos. And the fish are as big as the hippos because, again, it's information. You're also seeing it from as if you're looking from above into the water. So you get everything you need. It doesn't matter that they're not realistic. You're getting the information just fine. So you've got fish and hippos under the boat, the tiny little boat with this giant person on it, and then the little servants that are actually doing the killing, but he is out there risking his life, at least on the boat. But yeah, this is a very good example of Egyptian art. Now, okay, I want to talk about the New Kingdom, and we don't really have much time to start it now. So what we'll do, we'll see if there's questions or whatever now, but I've added, if you've had this class before, I've added something I've never had in this class before. So be sure to come back next time because we're going to talk about the Amarna period, which I usually don't take time to do. This class is scheduled to end on a specific day in May. It may or may not, because I've always been all my life I taught, I didn't have a choice, right? Classes begin this day, they end this day, that's it. So I always had to make terrible decisions. I don't have time to cover that, and I can't do this, but I'm not restricted by that anymore. And I've been restricting myself because I've set a beginning and ending date, and I'm not, and people are always upset when it ends. And so I'm not doing that anymore. And if it runs over a little bit and takes another week or two, you don't have to come anyway if you don't want to. So I'm not going to worry too much about it if we do run over a little bit. So we'll start next time and talk about the Amarna period. But does anybody have any questions or comments about anything? Yes.
How do we know this? Like, take that palette for instance.
Yeah.
How did we figure out what all those things mean?
Well, Egyptologists knew it. That's what they study. There are people that can read hieroglyphics. There are people that know how to read those forms. That's what's interesting about Egyptian art. In our world, there's writing and there's imagery, and they're two totally different things. But Egyptian hieroglyphics are image-based. They're just little pictures, and the images and the big images are just pictures, and the two merge together. And if you can read hieroglyphics, which Egyptologists can, it's not a secret language, then they can read other images, the symbols of other images as well. So Egyptologists have just studied it and learned it. If you can read a language, you can learn an awful lot. And we have cultures we're going to encounter that we still can't translate their language. And we're very limited in what we can know about them. But Egypt's not one of them. We can read all their languages, so we know a lot from their writing.
Is that because the knowledge was passed down through the generations? I mean, we didn't just go back and look at this stuff and invent what the hieroglyphics meant.
Well, yeah, we did, actually. We translated hieroglyphics in the 19th century when they found the Rosetta Stone. We weren't able to translate it before that. And heaven knows if we would have without it. But when they found the Rosetta Stone, Napoleon's people found it in the early 19th century. And that allowed the translation. So most Egyptology is in the modern world. So yeah, but that's an excellent question. You guys ask better questions than my students used to. Yes.
I'm just wondering, in your study of history, culture, archaeology, have you learned anything about how clothing changed? I'm always interested, the Egyptians were looking at their naked waist up, wearing skirts.
The kilt, yeah, the kilt is an important symbol of position and power as well. It's interesting. Yeah, you sort of unconsciously learn costume history, whether you're trying to or not, when you study art. And I've learned that it can be really bizarre.
When do you think trousers appear?
I'm trying to visualize the ancient world. Certainly not in the ancient world. Well, no, there were things like greaves. The ancient Greeks had things they would wrap around their legs to protect them. They weren't trousers, but you could wrap them. If you were riding horseback, you would wrap your legs. So they're intermediary. But the idea of comfort was really important for a long time. And in Greece, men and women dressed exactly the same way. The garments were identical. I never thought about that. Well, now I'm going to have to go. Well, there's before that. I mean,
when you think about like those pumpkin pants they wore like in the Renaissance, like in the 1500s, where men were wearing those and those pumpkin pants.
Well, that's 18. The 18th century is the weirdest century that ever existed. Everything was weird in the 18th century. But before then, I mean, I'm trying to think like in the medieval world. I mean, you see pants in the Near East. I'm visualizing some sculpture we're going to look at, some relief sculpture from the Persian Empire. They're wearing pants. It's about function. It depends on the climate you live in, what you do.
Eskimos need pants. Eskimos need pants.
Yeah, I mean, if you're living somewhere where it's cold, you're going to cover up as much as possible. That's a good question. Well, we'll watch for that as we go through.
I'd like to hear something about the Rosetta Stone.
Oh.
I'll see a picture of it and tell Paul if they learned from it. It wasn't just Egyptian, was it?
Yeah, it's a stone that was found during the Napoleonic. I don't know a lot about it. Napoleonic Empire. It's a stone that had the same thing written in 3 languages. That's what you need. And if you can read at least one of those, then you got it made. Now you can translate. And that's what did it. It was written in, I think, 2 different Greek languages, 2 different variations of Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs, or else 2 early Egyptian languages and a Greek. But anyway, it's because they found that. Then they could go, well, this means that. I mean, it really opened the door. It gave them the clue. Because the biggest difficulty in translating a language is not the details of what this or that mean, but is it a phonetic language? Is it a pictographic? Is it, what are these things? Are these words or syllables they stand for? Or do they stand for ideas? Or is it a combination of both of those? The hieroglyphs is a combination of both of those, because some of them stand for a thing, like the nar, that was the fish. So nar is a fish, but it's also the sound nar, which if your name's Narmer, then I just depict a fish. And it's a weird phonetic thing. Like my name's Peggy, right? So a peg is a little piece of wood. So I don't put a little piece of wood as a symbol for my name. So it's an interesting connection of the phonetic sound. So hieroglyphs have both meaning as ideas and also phonetic sounds, and they're combined in an interesting way. And I think the Rosetta Stone showed that, and that's what gave them the key that let them figure it out.
You can see it in the British Museum.
Yeah, yeah. British Museum's got all this
They got way too much.
of it. Yeah, stuff they shouldn't have, because none of it belongs to them. Well, that's not true. The Sutton Hoo treasury is there. That's all theirs. They can have that. But they have a lot more than that. Anything else?
I've been in the big pyramid. More.
Oh, really? Wow. How exciting. I wish I could. I couldn't have gone in there either. That's good.
No, it was shaft going way up.
Yeah, it goes all the way up, and it's very, very tall. You get into one section and it's way, way
went
up.
up to the very top, and it was just a sarcophagus empty.
Empty. Yeah, that's all there was. And as far as this like curse, you know, all the mummy movies, right? And the curse and seal. If there was, clearly nobody believed it, because every known Egyptian tomb anywhere has been looted. The only ones, so everything we have comes from tombs that were not discovered. So hiding them, the Valley of the Kings, we'll talk about that next time. But they just started, you know, digging them into the ground of the Valley of the Kings, and it's this massive area. Who knows how many more are out there untouched, but that's the way to do it. Don't advertise. Okay, if no more, then I'll see you next week and we'll continue.